One of the most intriguing stories in the Bible is that one time when the devil quoted scripture. Matthew tells us the story in chapter 4 of his gospel. He tells us of the time when the devil approached Jesus and tempted him, saying, "If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread." And Matthew tells us that Jesus replied by quoting the Bible. He says, "It is written, people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." At this point, Matthew tells us that the devil said, "Oh, Jesus, oh, you want to quote scripture? Well, I've got a scripture of mine for you." And we read about this in Matthew 4 5. It says, "Then the devil took him," speaking about Jesus, "to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written.'" So here we have the devil quoting the Bible. It is written, "He will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against the stone." So we have the devil here quoting Psalm 91. Now, let's just pause here and think about it. The devil is quoting the Bible. I don't know if this baffles your mind the way it does mine, but this is the arch enemy of God, the one who has hated God from the beginning, the one who has tried to thwart every single plan and purpose of God. We have him here quoting God's book. And so, what is the lesson that we learn from this? What is the implication of this? If the devil can quote the Bible, then being able to quote scripture, being able to memorize scripture, being able to know scripture is not necessarily a sign of spiritual life, right? Sometimes as Christians, we place such a high premium on knowing scripture, and we should. Don't get me wrong. It's important that we know scripture. It's important that we study theology. It's important that we are conversant and we can quote and memorize scripture. But what we are seeing here from the devil's ability to call scripture from mind is that just knowing about scripture or knowing scripture is not necessarily a sign of spiritual life. We can have all this information about God. We can be able to recall grave amount of scripture and yet not have life, because if being able to recall and memorize and know scripture was a necessary sign of spiritual life, then we must conclude that the devil is saved. But what we're seeing here is even the devil knows scripture but has no spiritual life. So we must be careful not to equate a knowledge of the Bible with a vital relationship with God. And so James reminds us, James 2:19, speaking to that church that he wrote to, "You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder," right? So demons believe, they're monotheists. They believe in one God. And James is saying that doesn't mean anything. So just being able to know certain truths doesn't mean anything. How do we judge the reality of spiritual life? Is does what we know change us? Are there fruits? Are we becoming more and being shaped and changed by the things that we know from God? And so we must be careful not to believe that just knowing scripture is a sign of spiritual life. Here's something else that we learn. We must be conscious of this, that the devil is still quoting scripture today. Or maybe I should say it like this: the devil is still misquoting scripture today. Right? Am I saying he's appearing to you and saying it is written? Not necessarily. The way the devil is operating in the world today is primarily through false teachers, false prophets, false apostles. I have a scripture for you. Paul, 2 Corinthians 11:13 to 15, speaking about some of these false teachers and false apostles. He says, "For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. That's 2 Corinthians 11:13 to 15. Satan is still speaking. He is still misquoting scripture. He is still masquerading through men and women who claim to speak for God but are not true. This is why, child of God, you must know the scriptures, because Satan is still speaking through his servants. And these are the words of Paul. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just echoing what Paul says, that the devil is still talking. He's talking through his servants who masquerade. That means they're deceptive. They come off as genuine. They call what they say Rheman, revelation, and sometimes it sounds very good. And if you do not know the scriptures for yourself, you will be deceived. You will be deceived. Think about this. How did Jesus counteract Satan's scriptural lie? He says, it is also written with scripture. He knew scripture. That's why he was not being deceived. Make no mistake. What Satan did here with Jesus is not an isolated event. He continues to speak through those who claim to be servants of God, but in truth are liars from Satan. Open your eyes, read the Bible, know it for yourself. All right, one more lesson. One more lesson that we learn from this story. How can we know when the devil is speaking? It's very clear from this scripture. He always uses scripture out of context. In other words, the devil doesn't so much quote scripture as he misquotes scripture, right? So when you read Psalm 91, it is not a license to throw yourself down. That's what he's telling Jesus here. You know, that God has promised such protection that you can go and throw yourself and God will still protect you. Thankfully, Jesus was able to decipher and say, no, Psalm 91 is a promise of protection, but not a test, right? But the devil is using that scripture as though, God is so good, you can throw yourself from a high building and he will give his angels charge over you. So he's misusing scripture to apply it to what God never intended for it to be. The devil is giving this idea that we will never face trouble, that life will be free of pain. If you know this God, you can put yourself in awkward situations and you will have no trouble. He's giving the idea that to be a Christian means you will never have trouble. But you see, if we even go to Psalm 91, here's what Psalm 91:15 says. God speaking, when he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. So, being a Christian does not mean you will not face trouble. It means that even in the midst of trouble, God will be with you there. But the devil was given the idea, because you know God, you will never face trouble. Life will be painless. Ladies and gentlemen, the devil speaks to us every time we misinterpret the Bible. He thrives on misunderstandings of God, on false views of God, on false beliefs of God. Every time you take a scripture out of context, you are potentially opening yourself up to be lied to by the devil. This is why we must insist on contextual study of the Bible. We must ask ourselves, is this what this scripture means? One of the questions I hate from Bible studies is, what does this mean to you? I understand where we're coming from. We're trying to say, how can we apply this? But the reality is, the right question should be this: what does this scripture mean? Whatever it means to me or to you does not matter. What does it mean? What did the author intend to say when he wrote it down? Every time we take scripture out of context, we are potentially opening up ourselves to the devil's lies and misinformations. If you forget anything I have said in this video, please remember this: study the Bible, and when you do, please make sure you pay attention to scripture. Otherwise, you will fall for the lies of Satan. I hope you've enjoyed this video. God bless you.